March 15, 2019. The director had just called Marcus Harrison, washed up in front of the entire cast and crew. 30 years of stunt work, 3 broken ribs, 2 shattered vertebrae, 1 dead best friend, and this was how it ended. Marcus walked to the edge of the 40-foot platform, looked down at the concrete below, and made a choice that would redefine his entire career. No safety harness, no backup plan, just muscle memory and 40 years of rage. What happened in the next 2 minutes became the most talked-about sequence in independent film history. The footage went viral within hours. Hollywood agents started calling before the blood dried. But what nobody knew was why Marcus really jumped. The secret buried in that script, the truth about his father, the choice between family honor and his own survival. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weight of silence. The Wyoming wind cut through Frank Harrison's flannel shirt as he stood on his porch, watching the dust cloud grow larger on the horizon. 37 years in this godforsaken place, and he could still tell the difference between a delivery truck and trouble coming down that gravel road. This wasn't a delivery truck. He squinted through the morning glare, his weathered hands gripping the porch rail. The vehicle, a silver SUV with California plates, slowed as it approached his gate. Frank's chest tightened. Hollywood had a way of finding people, even when they'd buried themselves in 8,000 acres of nowhere. The SUV stopped. The engine died. A young woman stepped out, maybe 30, Asian, wearing jeans and a lightweight jacket that screamed city money. She had a camera bag slung over her shoulder and moved with the purposeful stride of someone who'd driven a long way to have a conversation. Frank's hand moved instinctively to his back pocket, feeling the outline of his wallet where he kept the one photograph he should have burned decades ago. The photo that could destroy what little piece he'd carved out of this exile. The photo that proved Marcus Webb's version of Danny Torres's death was a lie. The woman approached the gate but didn't open it. Smart. She'd done her homework, knew not to trespass on a man who valued his solitude above all else. "Mr. Harrison?" Her voice carried across the yard, professional but warm. "My name is Maya Chen. I'm a documentary filmmaker from Los Angeles. I was hoping I could speak with you about your work in Hollywood." Frank said nothing. He'd perfected the art of silence, learned that most people would fill the void with information if you waited long enough. "I know you don't give interviews," Maya continued, pulling a folder from her bag. "But I'm working on a film about the golden age of stunt work, the coordinators who risked everything to create movie magic. Your name keeps coming up in my research." The folder bothered him. Research meant digging, and digging meant questions he'd spent 4 decades avoiding. "I'm retired," Frank called back, his voice gravelly from disuse. "Have been for a long time." Maya stepped closer to the gate, and Frank could see her face more clearly now. Something familiar tugged at the edges of his memory, but he couldn't place it. Maybe she just had one of those faces, or maybe 37 years of isolation had made every stranger look like a ghost from his past. "Mr. Harrison, I understand your reluctance, but the stories from people who worked with you, they describe sequences that changed how action films were made. The helicopter chase in Desert Thunder, the building collapse in Steel Rain, ancient history." Frank turned toward his front door, but Maya's next words stopped him cold. "And Blood Brothers, your last film." The desert wind seemed to pause, carrying only the sound of Frank's heartbeat in his ears. Nobody talked about Blood Brothers. The studio had buried that film so deep it might as well have never existed. "I know what happened on that set changed everything for you," Maya pressed on, her voice softer now. "I know about Danny Torres." Frank's hand tightened on the door handle. He could feel the weight of the secret pressing against his ribs, the same crushing sensation he'd felt every morning for 37 years. Some nights he dreamed about that Mojave set, about the sound of Danny hitting the ground, about Marcus Webb's face in the moments after, not grief but calculation. "You need to leave." Frank's words came out harsher than he intended. Maya pulled a photograph from her folder and held it up. Even from 50 yards away, Frank could see it was a headshot. Danny Torres, young and smiling, the same photo that had appeared in Variety when the studio announced his casting in Blood Brothers. He was 24 years old, Maya said. Had a daughter he never got to meet, a family that never got answers about what really happened that day. Frank felt something crack inside his chest. The photograph in his wallet seemed to burn against his hip, and suddenly he was back in the Mojave, watching Marcus Webb approach Danny's broken body with that calculating look, whispering instructions to the assistant director while the medics worked. "We stick to the story," Webb had said. "Equipment failure, nobody's fault. The kid took risks." But Frank had seen the rigging, had seen Webb's private conversation with the effects coordinator an hour before the stunt, had seen the fear in Danny's eyes when Webb insisted on changing the safety protocols at the last minute. Maya folded the photograph back into her folder, but the damage was done. Frank's carefully constructed walls were crumbling. "I'll be staying at the motel in town for a few days," Maya said, walking back toward her SUV. "In case you change your mind about talking." As she drove away, Frank remained frozen on his porch, watching the dust settle. In his pocket, Danny Torres's real death scene, the one Frank had photographed with a disposable camera while the studio spin doctors crafted their cover story, felt heavier than ever. The secret was stirring, demanding attention after decades of silence, and Frank Harrison was no longer sure he had the strength to keep it buried. The weight of memory. Frank stood motionless on his porch long after Maya's SUV disappeared behind the ridge, the dust settling like sediment in still water. The photograph of Danny Torres burned in his memory, that eager smile, those trusting eyes that had looked to Frank for guidance in those final hours. The same eyes that had widened with terror when the rigging gave way. The Wyoming wind picked up again, carrying the scent of sage and the distant promise of snow. October in the high country meant winter was coming, and Frank had preparations to make. Feed to haul, equipment to winterize, fences to check, the rhythms of ranch life that had anchored him for 37 years. But Maya Chen's visit had shattered his carefully maintained equilibrium, and the familiar tasks felt suddenly meaningless. He walked inside, letting the screen door bang shut behind him. The cabin was sparse, a kitchen, living room, and bedroom that held only what a man needed to survive. No photographs on the walls, no mementos from his Hollywood days. He'd learned long ago that the past had teeth, and the less you fed it, the less it could hurt you. But in the kitchen drawer, beneath repair manuals and veterinary supplies, lay his insurance policy, a manila envelope containing the photographs he'd taken that day in the Mojave. The ones that proved Danny's death was no accident. Frank pulled out his phone, an ancient flip model that barely got reception out here, and scrolled to the only contact that mattered. Sarah, his daughter. The reason he'd kept quiet all these years. His thumb hovered over the call button. Sarah was in post-production on her third feature film, finally hitting her stride as a director after years of fighting for recognition in an industry that chewed up women and spit them out. She'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much, for Frank to destroy it all with the truth about blood brothers. Because Marcus Webb wasn't just any director. He was Hollywood royalty now, the man behind billion-dollar franchises and Oscar-winning dramas, the man whose recommendation had gotten Sarah her first real break, the man who'd made it clear through carefully worded conversations over the years that Frank's silence was the price of his daughter's career. The kid took risks, Webb had said about Danny, and later, when Frank had confronted him with what he'd seen, "Your daughter has real talent, Frank. Be a shame if the industry turned against her because of her father's instability." Frank closed the phone without dialing. Outside, his cattle dog Rex was barking at something near the barn, probably a coyote testing the boundaries. The sound echoed across the valley, sharp and urgent in the thin air. He walked to the window and saw Rex circling near the old grain silo, hackles raised. But there was nothing there, just shadows and the play of afternoon light through the gaps in the weathered boards. Even his dog was spooked today, sensing the disturbance Maya's visit had brought to their quiet world. The phone rang, startling him. Sarah's name appeared on the tiny screen and Frank's heart lurched. Had she somehow heard about Maya already? Hollywood was a small town dressed up like a big city. Information traveled fast among the people who mattered. "Dad?" Sarah's voice was warm but tired. "Just wanted to check in." The editing suite is driving me crazy, but we're making progress. Good, Frank managed. How much longer? Another month, maybe 2. The studio wants to rush it, but I'm not compromising the vision. She paused. You sound strange. Everything okay up there? Frank looked out at his land, the rolling hills dotted with cattle, the mountains purple in the distance, the sky so big it seemed to swallow the horizon. This place had saved him once, given him purpose when everything else fell apart. But now it felt fragile, like a house of cards waiting for the wrong breath of wind. Just tired, he said. Getting old. Sarah laughed, the sound carrying decades of affection. You're tougher than the mountains, Dad. Always have been. Remember when I was little and you used to tell me stories about the stunts you coordinated? I thought you were the bravest man in the world. Frank's throat tightened. Sarah had been 8 when he'd left Hollywood, old enough to remember the excitement but young enough to accept his explanation that he wanted a quieter life. She'd never questioned why her successful father had suddenly abandoned everything to become a rancher. Never suspected that her hero was actually a coward who'd traded truth for her future. I love you, kiddo, he said, the words rough with emotion. Love you too, Dad. Get some rest, okay? After she hung up, Frank stood in his kitchen listening to the silence. Rex had stopped barking, but the unease remained, settling in his bones like the ache of an old injury before rain. Maya Chen knew something. The way she'd spoken about Danny, about his daughter, there was more to her research than she'd revealed, and somewhere in town she was waiting for him to break. The secret was no longer sleeping. After 37 years, it was finally waking up. Inciting incident. Frank couldn't sleep. He lay in his narrow bed listening to the house settle around him, the old timbers creaking like arthritic joints. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind rattling the windows, Rex pacing restlessly on the porch, the distant lowing of cattle disturbed by something in the darkness. At 3 in the morning, he gave up and padded to the kitchen in his bare feet. The coffee maker gurgled to life, and Frank stood at the window watching shadows move across his property. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver relief, making the familiar landscape look foreign and threatening. That's when he saw the headlights. 2 beams cutting through the darkness, moving slowly up his access road. Frank's blood chilled. Nobody drove out here at this hour unless something was seriously wrong. He grabbed the shotgun from behind the door and stepped onto the porch, Rex materializing beside him with a low growl. The vehicle, a pickup truck he didn't recognize, stopped at his gate but didn't shut off the engine. Frank could make out a figure in the cab, but the headlight glare made identification impossible. After a long moment, the driver stepped out. Frank Harrison? The voice was unfamiliar, male, with the flat vowels of the upper Midwest. I need to talk to you. Private property, Frank called back, not lowering the shotgun. You're trespassing. My name is Robert Torres. The man moved into the headlight beams, and Frank's world tilted on its axis. The face was older, weathered by decades of hard living, but the bone structure was unmistakable. Danny's father. I think you knew my son. Frank's grip on the shotgun trembled. He'd seen Robert Torres exactly once, at Danny's funeral 37 years ago, a broken man in an ill-fitting suit, accepting condolences from studio executives who spoke in careful euphemisms about tragic accidents and dangerous professions. Frank had stood in the back, drowning in guilt, watching a father bury his child while the truth festered in his camera. I'm sorry for your loss, Frank said, the words automatic and hollow across the decades. But that was a long time ago. Robert took another step forward, close enough now that Frank could see his face clearly. The resemblance to Danny was heartbreaking, the same dark eyes, the same stubborn jaw, but where Danny had radiated youth and possibility, his father carried the weight of unanswered questions and unhealed wounds. A documentary filmmaker came to see me last week, Robert said. Maya Chen said she was researching the golden age of stunt work, but she had questions about Danny, specific questions about what happened on the Blood Brothers set. Frank's chest constricted. Maya hadn't just been fishing when she'd driven out here. She'd been following a trail that led straight to the truth. She showed me something, Robert continued, pulling a folder from his truck. something I've never seen before. Frank watched in growing horror as Robert opened the folder and withdrew a photograph. Even in the harsh headlight glare, Frank could see it clearly. A production still from Blood Brothers, showing the stunt rigging just before Danny's fatal fall. But this wasn't one of the official photos. The angle was wrong, taken from ground level by someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The studio said equipment failure, Robert said, his voice steady but laced with decades of suppressed rage. Said Danny pushed too hard, took unnecessary risks. But this photo shows something different, doesn't it? Frank's mouth went dry. The photograph showed the rigging exactly as it had been, not failed equipment, but deliberately sabotaged cables, the kind of sabotage that would be invisible to a stunt performer until it was too late. I don't know what you want me to say, Frank managed. I want you to tell me the truth. Robert's composure cracked, revealing the raw grief beneath. My son died thinking he'd made a mistake, died believing he'd disappointed the people counting on him. For 37 years I've lived with that. But this photo, someone was there. Someone saw what really happened. Frank thought of the manila envelope hidden in his kitchen drawer, of the photographs he'd taken showing Marcus Webb's conversation with the effects coordinator, showing the deliberate modification of the safety equipment. Evidence that would destroy Webb's career and prove Danny had been murdered for refusing to perform an even more dangerous version of the stunt. Maya Chen, Frank said carefully. How did she get that photo? Robert's smile was bitter. She inherited it, along with a box of her father's things that her adoptive parents finally gave her. He paused, letting the words sink in. You see, Frank, Maya isn't just some random documentary filmmaker. She's Danny's daughter, the child he never got to meet. The shotgun slipped from Frank's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the porch boards. Rex whined and pressed against his legs, sensing his distress. The secret Frank had protected for 37 years wasn't just awakening, it was exploding, taking his carefully constructed world with it. Danny's daughter had found him, and she was carrying evidence that could destroy them all. Early development. Frank's legs gave out. He sank onto the porch steps, the cold wood biting through his pajama pants. Rex pressed closer, whimpering at the tremor that ran through his master's body. Danny's daughter. The child who'd been born 3 months after her father's death, the one Danny had been so excited about in those final weeks of filming. She doesn't know, Robert said, reading Frank's expression. About you, I mean. She found your name in some old production notes. Thinks you might have stories about her father's work. She has no idea you were there when he died. Frank's hands shook as he gripped his knees. The Wyoming night felt suddenly arctic, wind cutting through his thin clothing like knives. What does she want? The truth. Same as me. Robert stepped closer to the gate, his face haggard in the headlight glare. But she's approaching it from the inside, Frank. She's got access to people, archives, industry connections. She's not going away. I can't... Frank's voice cracked. My daughter, Sarah. She's finally making it as a director. If this comes out... Your daughter. Robert's laugh was bitter. My son never got the chance to have a daughter. Never got the chance to have anything because Marcus Webb decided he was expendable. The name hung in the air between them like a curse. Frank hadn't spoken it aloud in years, but it lived in his nightmares, whispered in the wind that rattled his windows on restless nights. Marcus Webb, the golden boy director who'd built an empire on other people's graves. You don't understand, Frank said desperately. Webb has connections everywhere. He destroyed careers for less than what I know. If I talk... He already destroyed Danny's career, and Danny's life. Robert's voice hardened. How many others, Frank? How many other accidents have there been over the years? Frank thought of the rumors that had followed Webb through 3 decades of blockbuster success. Stunt performers who'd spoken out about unsafe conditions and found themselves blacklisted. Effects coordinators who'd questioned his methods and disappeared from big-budget productions, always explained away as creative differences or personality conflicts, never anything actionable. I need to think, Frank said weakly. Robert pulled out his phone, the screen's blue glow adding ghostly shadows to his weathered face. "Maya's number," he said, showing Frank the contact. "She's staying at the Pine Ridge Motel in town. Room 12. The information felt like a loaded gun being placed in Frank's hands. Danny's daughter, so close he could drive there in 20 minutes. The child who'd grown up without knowing her father was a hero, not the reckless daredevil the studio had painted him as. "She looks like him," Robert said quietly. "Same stubborn chin, same way of tilting her head when she's thinking. But she's got her mother's eyes, Maria's eyes. Maria died when Maya was 2, cancer. Maya bounced around foster care for years before finding a good family." He paused. "She deserves to know who her father really was." Frank's chest ached with the weight of unshed tears. He'd carried this secret so long it had become part of his skeleton, holding him upright even as it poisoned him from within. The manila envelope in his kitchen drawer contained more than evidence. It held Danny's vindication, proof that he'd died because he'd refused to compromise safety for spectacle. "Webb called me yesterday," Robert said, and Frank's blood turned to ice. After 37 years of silence, suddenly he wants to have lunch, catch up on old times, talk about how proud he is of Danny's memory. The timing wasn't coincidence. Webb knew Maya was digging. His network of informants in the industry would have flagged her inquiries, traced her lineage back to Danny within days. The man who'd orchestrated one murder was preparing to protect himself from exposure. He's scared, Frank realized. He should be. Robert folded the photograph carefully back into its folder. Because Maya isn't some naive kid he can intimidate. She's smart, determined, and she's got backing from a major streaming platform. A documentary is going to get made with or without your cooperation. Frank's mind raced through the implications. Maya had enough pieces to ask dangerous questions. Webb would move to discredit her, maybe even threaten her, the same way he'd silenced others over the years. But she was Danny's daughter. She had her father's stubborn courage, the same quality that had gotten him killed. "What do you want from me?" Frank asked. Robert's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I want you to remember that some secrets are worth more than the people they're supposed to protect. My son died believing he'd failed. His daughter grew up believing her father was reckless. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb collects Lifetime Achievement Awards and sleeps soundly in his mansion." The headlights cut out suddenly, plunging them into moonlit darkness. Frank heard Robert's truck door slam, the engine turning over. "Maya's documentary premieres in 6 months," Robert called through his open window. "With or without your help, the truth is coming out. You can be part of the solution, or you can go down with Webb when it all collapses." The truck's taillights disappeared down the access road, leaving Frank alone with the weight of revelation. Danny's daughter was in town, carrying evidence that could destroy them all. Webb was mobilizing his defenses, and Frank sat trapped between his love for Sarah and his debt to the dead. The secret was no longer stirring. It was fully awake and demanding justice. Frank remained on the porch steps long after Robert's taillights vanished into the darkness, his body numb from more than just the mountain cold. Rex had given up trying to comfort him, and now lay pressed against his side, a warm anchor in the storm of revelation threatening to tear Frank's world apart. Danny's daughter. The words echoed in his skull like a death knell. For 37 years, Frank had imagined Danny's child as an abstract concept, a tragedy averted by Danny's death, a life that would never have to carry the burden of knowing how her father really died. But Maya Chen was real, breathing, asking questions, and she was as doomed as her father had been the moment she'd started digging into Marcus Webb's past. Frank forced himself to stand, his joints protesting the movement. Inside, the kitchen felt like a tomb, shadows pressing in from all corners. He pulled out the manila envelope with trembling hands, spreading the photographs across his scarred wooden table like tarot cards predicting disaster. There was Danny in the final shot Frank had taken, harness secure, checking his equipment one last time before the stunt that would kill him. The young man's face was serious but unafraid, a professional doing what he loved. In the next frame, Webb stood 50 yards away, watching through his viewfinder as the effects coordinator made final adjustments to the rigging. adjustments that Frank's telephoto lens had captured in devastating detail. The loosened bolts, the deliberately weakened cable, the small piece of metal that would snap under stress, sending Danny plummeting 40 feet to the rocky ground below. Frank had been documenting the stunt sequence for the insurance company, a routine assignment that had turned into evidence of premeditated murder. He'd been positioned too far away to warn Danny, could only watch in horror as the equipment failed exactly as Webb had orchestrated. By the time Frank reached the accident scene, Danny was already gone, and Webb was performing his grief-stricken director routine for the gathering crowd. "Equipment failure," Webb had declared, his voice breaking with practiced emotion. Danny was pushing himself too hard. "I should have stopped him." Frank's phone rang, jarring him from the memory. The caller ID showed a Los Angeles area code he didn't recognize, but something in his gut told him to answer. "Mr. Harrison?" The voice was young, female, tinged with the careful politeness of someone used to being dismissed. "This is Maya Chen. I'm sorry to call so late, but I just spoke with Robert Torres, and he said you might be willing to talk about my father." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Hearing her voice, Danny's voice, filtered through time and genetics, made the abstract suddenly, terrifyingly real. This wasn't just about protecting Sarah anymore. This was about a daughter seeking her father, walking unknowingly into the same trap that had killed him. "It's late," Frank managed. "I know, and I apologize. But Mr. Torres told me some things tonight that, well, they've changed everything about my documentary. I need to ask you some questions, and I don't think they can wait." Frank closed his eyes, seeing Danny's face in those final photographs. The young stuntman had been asking questions too, pushing back against Webb's increasingly dangerous demands. That's what had gotten him killed. Not equipment failure, but the director's cold calculation that Danny Torres was becoming a liability. "What kind of questions?" Frank heard himself ask. "About the safety protocols on Blood Brothers. About why my father's equipment failed when he'd checked it personally just minutes before. About why the insurance investigation was shut down so quickly." Maya's voice carried an edge now, the politeness falling away to reveal steel underneath. "And about why Marcus Webb called me yesterday, offering to finance my documentary if I focused on the positive aspects of my father's legacy." Frank's blood turned to ice. Webb was moving faster than expected, trying to control the narrative before it could destroy him. The same pattern he'd used for decades: co-opt the threat, redirect the investigation, make the truth disappear under layers of Hollywood spin and corporate protection. "He wants to meet with me tomorrow," Maya continued. "Says he has stories about my father that I'll want to hear. But something feels wrong about it, Mr. Harrison. Something feels dangerous." Frank gripped the phone so hard the plastic creaked. Maya was walking into the same trap that had killed her father, and she knew it. She could feel the danger the way Danny had in those final weeks, the growing sense that asking questions was becoming a mortal risk. "Don't go," Frank said urgently. "Whatever he's offering, don't, and help me understand why." Maya's voice cracked with desperation. "Everyone I've talked to gives me the same careful responses, the same sanitized version of what happened. But you were there, Mr. Harrison. You took the insurance photos. You know what really happened on that set." Frank looked down at the evidence spread across his table, photographs that could vindicate Danny, destroy Webb, and almost certainly end Sarah's career in the process. 37 years of silence hung in the balance, along with 2 lives that mattered more than his own cowardice. The secret wasn't just awake now, it was screaming for justice, and Frank could no longer pretend he couldn't hear it. Frank stared at the photographs spread before him, Maya's voice still echoing in his ear through the phone's speaker. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 37 years of carefully maintained lies. He could hear her breathing on the other end, waiting for an answer that would either save her life or destroy everything he'd sacrificed to protect. "Mr. Harrison?" Maya's voice was smaller now, vulnerable in a way that made Frank's chest ache. "Are you still there?" "I'm here," he whispered, his throat raw. "Maya, I need to tell you something about your father, about that day. Please." Frank picked up the photograph of Danny checking his harness, the young man's face bright with the confidence of someone who believed the world was fundamentally fair. Your father wasn't reckless. The studio painted him that way after he died, but it was a lie. Danny was the most careful stuntman I ever worked with. Then why? Because Marcus Webb needed him dead. The words tumbled out of Frank like a confession, 37 years of guilt finally finding voice. Danny had been asking questions about safety protocols, refusing to perform stunts that were too dangerous. Webb was under pressure from the studio to deliver bigger spectacle, and Danny was standing in his way. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Frank wondered if the call had dropped. Then Maya spoke, her voice barely audible. "You're saying my father was murdered? I have photographs, evidence. Webb arranged for the equipment to be sabotaged. I documented the whole thing for the insurance company, but when Danny died, Frank's voice broke. I was a coward. I buried the evidence and let them destroy your father's reputation. Why?" The word came out as a sob. "Why didn't you speak up?" Frank thought of Sarah, barely 22 then, just starting out as an assistant director. Webb had made his position clear after Danny's death. Anyone who questioned the official story would find themselves unemployable in Hollywood. Frank had chosen his daughter's future over Danny's memory, and the decision had poisoned every day since. "I was protecting someone," Frank said weakly, "someone I loved." "More than you loved the truth?" Maya's voice cut through him like a blade. "More than you loved my father's memory? More than you cared about his daughter growing up, believing her father died because he was careless?" Each word landed like a physical blow. Frank saw himself clearly for the first time. Not a protective father, but a man who had chosen comfort over courage, silence over justice. He had told himself for decades that he was saving Sarah, but the truth was simpler and more damning. He had been saving himself. "Maya," Frank began, but she cut him off. "Do you know what it's like to grow up believing your father was reckless? To hear people whisper that he brought his death on himself? I've spent my entire career trying to prove that stunt performers are professionals, not adrenaline junkies with death wishes. And all this time, you had evidence that my father was exactly the kind of professional I've been defending." Frank closed his eyes, seeing Danny's face in those final photographs. The young man who had died believing he had somehow failed, when in truth he had been murdered for having principles. "I can give you the photographs," Frank said quietly. "All of them. Evidence of what Webb did, how he covered it up afterward." "It's too late for that." Maya's voice was steady now, cold with purpose. "Because I already know the truth. The photograph Robert showed you tonight? It wasn't the only evidence my father left behind. He documented everything. Webb's unsafe demands, the pressure to perform increasingly dangerous stunts, the threats when he refused to comply." Frank's blood turned to ice. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying my father knew he was in danger. He knew Webb was planning something, so he left a record. Photographs, audio recordings, written testimony about what was happening on that set. Everything I needed to prove he was murdered. Then why—" Frank's voice caught. "Why did you call me? Why are you here?" Maya's laugh was bitter, sharp with the pain of betrayal, "Because I needed to know if anyone would have stood up for him, if anyone had the courage to tell the truth when it mattered." Her voice hardened. "I needed to know if the people who claimed to care about my father were heroes or cowards." The photographs blurred as Frank's eyes filled with tears. He had failed Danny in life and death, failed Maya in her search for justice. 37 years of telling himself he had no choice, when the truth was he had simply chosen wrongly. "Marcus Webb told me something interesting when he called," Maya continued, her voice now carrying the calm precision of someone revealing their final card. "He said the only person who might have evidence was a washed-up old stuntman who drinks too much and lives alone with his regrets. He was so confident you'd never talk, so certain that fear would keep you silent forever." Webb's arrogance, his casual dismissal of Frank as irrelevant, suddenly reframed everything. The powerful director who had built an empire on other people's graves, who had orchestrated murder and walked away untouched, who believed himself untouchable. Frank looked at the evidence spread across his table, and realized that his cowardice had been Webb's greatest protection. But cowardice, like silence, could be broken. Frank sat in the harsh fluorescent light of his kitchen, staring at the photographs of Danny's final moments, while Maya's words echoed in his mind like a judgment pronounced from beyond the grave. Heroes or cowards? The question cut deeper than any blade, exposing the rot at the center of 37 years of careful self-deception. He picked up his phone and dialed before he could lose his nerve. "Sarah, I know it's late, but I need to see you." His daughter's voice was thick with sleep and concern. "Dad, what's wrong? You sound—" "I need to tell you about Danny Torres, about why I really left Hollywood." Frank's voice cracked on the admission. "About the choice I made that's been eating me alive for 37 years. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of secrets finally demanding their due. "I'll be right there," Sarah said quietly. Frank hung up and walked to the bathroom mirror, confronting the face that had aged decades in the span of a single evening. The man staring back at him was a stranger, hollowed out, grey with guilt, eyes that had seen too much and said too little. He thought of Maya, alone in her motel room with evidence that could topple an empire, preparing to face down the same monster that had killed her father. She was 27 years old, the same age Danny had been when Webb murdered him. The parallels were too precise to be coincidence. Webb's arrogance had always been his weakness, the need to prove his superiority, to demonstrate his power over those who dared challenge him. He hadn't just called Maya to control the narrative, he was playing with her, the same way he'd played with Danny in those final weeks, letting his victim know exactly how powerless they were before delivering the killing blow. But Maya wasn't powerless. She had her father's evidence, her own documentation, and now Frank's photographs to corroborate the truth. More importantly, she had something Danny never possessed, knowledge of the trap before it closed. Frank returned to the kitchen table, studying the photographs with new eyes. The image of Webb watching the rigging being sabotaged wasn't just evidence of murder, it was a portrait of evil in its purest form. Calculated, patient, utterly without conscience, the director had stood 50 yards away, watching his hired killers prepare Danny's death with the same detached interest he might show while reviewing dailies. Headlights swept across the kitchen window as Sarah's car pulled into the drive. Frank heard her quick steps on the porch, the key turning in the lock. When she appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pale with worry, he saw Danny in her features, the same stubborn determination, the same refusal to back down from what was right. "Dad, you're scaring me." "What's this about?" Frank gestured to the photographs spread across the table. "Sit down, sweetheart. This is going to be hard to hear." Sarah pulled out a chair, her eyes taking in the evidence with growing horror. As a director herself, she understood immediately what she was seeing. The systematic sabotage of safety equipment, documented with clinical precision. Oh my God, when were these taken? "The day Danny Torres died. I was the insurance photographer. I watched it happen and did nothing to stop it." Frank's voice was steady now, calm with the certainty of long-delayed confession. "And then I buried the evidence to protect your career." "To protect?" Sarah's face went white. "Dad, no. Tell me you didn't stay silent about murder because of me." The anguish in her voice was worse than any accusation. Frank had spent decades telling himself he was a good father, sacrificing his conscience for his child's future. But looking at Sarah's face now, seeing her horror at being made complicit in his cowardice, he understood the true price of his choice. He had saved her career by poisoning both their souls. "Webb threatened to blacklist anyone who questioned the official story," Frank said weakly. "You were just starting out, and I couldn't bear to see your dreams destroyed because of my conscience." "My dreams?" Sarah's voice rose with fury and heartbreak. "You think I would have wanted a career built on covering up murder? You think I could have lived with that?" Frank looked at his daughter, truly looked at her for the first time in years, and saw not the fragile young woman he'd been protecting, but the strong, principled person she'd become despite his choices. Sarah had spent her entire career fighting for safety protocols, advocating for stunt performers, standing up to studio pressure. She had become everything Danny Torres had died trying to be, while Frank's silence had enabled the very corruption she spent her life fighting. "Danny's daughter is here," Frank said quietly. "Maya Chen. She's making a documentary, and she has all her father's evidence. Webb is trying to control her the same way he controlled the investigation 37 years ago." Sarah's face hardened with resolve. "Then we stop him." The simple declaration hung between them, 3 words that could destroy everything Frank had sacrificed to build. But looking at his daughter's face, seeing Danny's courage reflected in her eyes, Frank finally understood what he had to do. The time for cowardice was over. Frank reached for his phone with hands that no longer trembled. The clarity that came with finally choosing courage felt like stepping out of a fog that had blinded him for decades. "Maya? It's Frank Harrison. Mr. Harrison?" Her voice was cautious, distant. "I wasn't sure I'd hear from you again. Don't meet with Webb tomorrow. Come to my ranch instead. There's someone here you need to meet, and something we need to do together." Sarah was already reaching for the photographs, studying them with a director's eye for detail. When she looked up at Frank, her expression had transformed from shock to steely determination. "We're going to destroy him," she said quietly. "Maya," Frank continued into the phone, "my daughter is here with me, Sarah Harrison. She's a director, and she spent her entire career fighting the kind of corruption that killed your father. We want to help you finish what Danny started." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for Frank to wonder if he'd lost her. Then Maya's voice came through, smaller but steadier. "Your daughter is Sarah Harrison? I know her work. She's one of the reasons I believe the industry could change." Sarah took the phone from Frank's hands. "Maya? This is Sarah. My father just told me what really happened to your father. I'm so sorry for Danny's death, for the cover-up, for every lie that's been told about him since." Her voice cracked slightly. "But we're going to make this right. All of us together." Frank watched his daughter transform before his eyes, seeing the leader she'd become despite his failures. This was who Sarah truly was, not the fragile young woman he'd imagined protecting, but a force for justice who would have gladly sacrificed her career for truth if he'd given her the choice. "There's something else," Maya said, her voice gaining strength. "Webb didn't just call to control my documentary. He's been tracking my research for months, trying to figure out what evidence I have. But he doesn't know about the recordings my father made in his final weeks, conversations where Webb explicitly threatened him." Frank felt his heart stop. "Recordings?" "Audio of Webb telling my father that accidents happen to stunt performers who don't know their place. Video of him ordering the safety coordinator to approve equipment that was clearly compromised." Maya's voice carried the cold satisfaction of someone holding the winning hand. "My father knew he was walking into a trap. He just couldn't prove it before Webb killed him." Sarah gripped Frank's arm. "Maya, where is this evidence now?" "Safe, copied and stored in multiple locations. But I needed corroboration. Independent witnesses who could verify what really happened on that set. That's why I came to Wyoming. That's why I needed to know if anyone would stand with me when I exposed the truth." Frank understood now why Maya had called him, why she'd pushed so hard for his story. She hadn't needed his photographs to prove the murder. She'd needed his conscience. Danny's daughter had inherited her father's courage, but she'd also learned from his mistakes. She wouldn't face Webb's power alone. "What do you need from us?" Frank asked. "I need you to go on record, both of you. I need Sarah to speak about the culture of intimidation that lets men like Webb silence anyone who threatens them. And I need your photographs, Frank. Not as evidence of the crime, but as evidence of the cover-up, proof that the truth has been hidden for 37 years by people who chose their careers over justice." The words should have stung, but Frank felt only relief. Maya wasn't just exposing Webb. She was offering redemption to everyone who had been complicit in the silence. A chance to transform 37 years of cowardice into a single moment of courage that might prevent other deaths, other cover-ups. "Webb's going to fight back," Sarah warned. "He has power, connections, money. He's destroyed careers for less than this." Maya's laugh was sharp with her father's defiance. "Let him try. I'm not a 27-year-old stunt performer with everything to lose. I'm a documentary filmmaker with nothing left to fear and everything to gain. More importantly, I'm Danny Torres's daughter, and I've been preparing for this fight my entire life. Frank felt something shift in his chest, the weight he'd carried for decades finally lifting. When do we do this? Tomorrow. While Webb thinks he's meeting with me to negotiate silence, we'll be releasing everything. The evidence, the recordings, your testimony, all of it at once, too much for him to control or contain. Sarah was nodding, her expression fierce with anticipation. He thinks he's untouchable. That's his weakness. That's what killed my father, Maya agreed. Webb's absolute certainty that fear would always win, the truth could always be buried under enough pressure. Her voice carried the weight of a daughter's love and a lifetime of seeking justice. Tomorrow we prove him wrong. Frank looked at the photographs one final time, seeing Danny's face in those last moments before the equipment failed. The young man who had died believing himself alone, betrayed by everyone around him. He wouldn't be alone anymore. The earthquake that toppled Marcus Webb's empire began at 6 a.m. Pacific time with a synchronized release across every major news platform. Frank sat in his kitchen, watching his old world burn on the small television screen, feeling something he hadn't experienced in 37 years, peace. Maya's documentary footage played on the morning shows, Danny Torres's voice, young and determined, describing the systematic intimidation he faced from a director who saw stunt performers as expendable props. Then Webb's voice caught on hidden recording, cold with calculated menace. Accidents happen to performers who don't know their place, Danny. Don't make yourself expendable. The photographs Frank had hidden for decades filled newspaper front pages and news websites. His insurance documentation, clinical and undeniable, showed the sabotaged equipment alongside timestamps proving Webb's knowledge of the sabotage. But it was Sarah's testimony that cut deepest, a respected director's unflinching condemnation of the culture that had enabled murder to masquerade as misfortune. By noon, Webb's attorneys had issued statements denying everything. By evening, 3 former crew members had come forward with corroborating testimony they'd carried silently for decades. By the following morning, the district attorney had announced a criminal investigation into Danny Torres's death. Frank's phone rang constantly. Reporters, investigators, old colleagues calling to apologize for their own silence or to share stories of Webb's intimidation. Each conversation felt like shedding skin, sloughing off years of accumulated guilt and complicity. He answered every call with the same calm honesty, finally free to speak without calculation or fear. 3 weeks later, Frank drove to Los Angeles for the first time since 1987. The city looked smaller somehow, less imposing. The mighty studios that had once seemed like impregnable fortresses were just buildings filled with people, some corrupt, some courageous, most simply trying to do their jobs without causing harm. Maya met him at Danny's grave in Forest Lawn. She had visited every week since learning the truth, she told him, talking to her father about everything she'd discovered, everyone who had finally found the courage to speak. The headstone bore new flowers, roses from Maya, but also offerings from strangers who had learned Danny's real story and wanted to honor his memory. The criminal charges won't stick, Maya said without preamble. Too much time has passed. Too many witnesses are dead. Webb will probably escape justice. Frank nodded. He had expected this. The legal system was ill-equipped to prosecute murders that had been successfully concealed for nearly 4 decades. But he won't escape consequences. Maya smiled, the expression transforming her face from grieving daughter to satisfied daughter. No studio will hire him. His production company is hemorrhaging investors. 3 other victims have come forward with their own stories. Marcus Webb is finished in this town. They stood in comfortable silence, watching groundskeepers tend to other graves. Frank thought about the different kinds of justice, legal verdicts and moral reckonings, courtroom convictions and industry exile. Webb would live with wealth and comfort, but he would die knowing his legacy was murder and corruption, not the artistic achievement he'd craved. There's something else, Maya said. Sarah and I have been talking about establishing a foundation, the Danny Torres Foundation for Stunt Performer Safety. Real oversight, real consequences for directors who prioritize spectacle over human life. Frank felt his throat tighten with pride. His daughter had inherited his eye for detail and safety protocols, but she'd combined it with the moral courage he'd lost. She was building the career he should have had. Fearless, principled, using her position to protect the vulnerable rather than enable the powerful. "Your father would be proud of what you're building," Frank told Maya. "He would be proud of what you finally chose," she replied. "It takes courage to admit you've been wrong for 37 years. It takes even more courage to do something about it." Frank touched the headstone, feeling the weight of Danny's name carved into granite. The young man had died believing his principles would die with him, that fear and corruption would always triumph over justice and truth. But principles, Frank had learned, were like seeds. They could lie dormant for decades before the right conditions allowed them to bloom. When Frank returned to Wyoming, the ranch looked exactly the same but felt completely different. The isolation that had once felt like punishment now felt like peace, not the peace of someone hiding from the world, but of someone who had finally rejoined it on his own terms. The silence was no longer heavy with secrets but light with possibility. He kept a copy of Maya's completed documentary on his coffee table, watching it sometimes in the evenings. The film was dedicated to Danny Torres and all the voices that refused to stay silent. Frank appeared in the final minutes, grey-haired and weathered, speaking directly to the camera. "I stayed quiet for 37 years because I thought silence was safety. I learned too late that silence is just another word for complicity." The documentary ended with footage of the Danny Torres Foundation's first safety conference, Sarah and Maya presenting new protocols to an audience of stunt performers and directors. Frank watched his daughter speak about courage and conscience, about choosing what's right over what's convenient, and felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had finally earned his place in his child's story. Outside his kitchen window, Wyoming stretched endlessly under an October sky, beautiful and vast and clean. Frank Harrison was 70 years old, alone by choice rather than shame, and for the first time in nearly 4 decades, completely free.